Welcome to this video about understanding whole airplane parachute deployments for Cirrus and other aircraft, a discussion that I'm having with my fellow air traffic controllers. For the record, I'm filming this on January 20th of 2021. In this video, we're going to talk about two main things. Number one, what should controllers understand is going on once we understand one of these parachute deployments has begun? And number two, we're going to ask the provocative question about whether and how and under what circumstances controllers might possibly recommend to pilots that they pull the chute. So let's get started with what I'm calling kind of the basics. We'll start by going to the home site, the home page for a company known as BRS Aerospace. BRS stands for Ballistic Recovery Systems, and that's kind of the generic name. As they're installed in the Cirrus aircraft, they're often called the CAPS system, CAPS, the Cirrus Airframe Parachute System. But if you look at the homepage here for this company of BRS Aerospace, you'll notice that it says developed to be standard equipment on both Cirrus and Icon. It's the only retrofit that's certified for Cessna 172s and 182s, and it can be built in from the get-go or retrofitted to existing or rather experimental and home-built type aircraft, kit-built airplanes, the Vans, Cub Crafters, Glazair, Lancers, 350 other models, and so on. Having said that, from a controller's perspective, virtually all of the planes that we work that will have a parachute will be a Cirrus and maybe an Icon. But because other airplanes can have them, if that's the case, we might see some parachutes with some of these other airplanes, but I wouldn't assume going in that most 172s or 182s have these parachutes. That's a very small percentage of the fleet that has these systems. Okay, having said that, to really get started here with the basics, I can do no better than watch the bulk of the video put together by Paul Bertorelli of AvWeb. So I will note as we get started, I'm going to watch the bulk of his video at 2x speed. Paul is charging me by the minute, and he charges such high confiscatory rates because he's so good. The only way I can afford it is if we play it at 2x speed. Don't complain, controllers, about somebody talking too fast. You know how that's going to work. But if you think that he's talking too fast, just play it at half speed. That way, we only have to pay him half as much because we're playing it at double speed here in this video. And I just saved the government a whole bunch of money, and I should get a huge award.
You can hit pause if you've heard this one. Two guys walk into a bar. They're airplane guys. One says to the other, hey, how about this? We put a rocket in the baggage compartment of an airplane, and then we tie a parachute to it. And if the pilot's about to crash or he gets scared, he can push a button and lower the whole thing to the ground. Who would do this? Who would believe it? Well, these two guys did. That's Alan and Dale Klapmeyer. This guy sold them the parachute. His name is Boris Popov. His company is called Ballistic Recovery Systems. And while you weren't looking or maybe thinking about it, this parachute system, called the Cirrus Aircraft Parachute System, or CAPS, has been out there flying for 20 years. Yep, that long. But it's still enough of a novelty that if there's a camera around, and when is there not a camera around, the footage will make the evening news. Not quite up to Russian dashcam standards maybe, but eye-catching nonetheless. Now, I wouldn't say all pilots are egotistical jerks exactly, but we can be kind of funny, you know? Like somehow you're not a real pilot if you got to fly around with a parachute to pull your fat out of the fire. So when the Cirrus parachute system first appeared, the whisper campaign started right away. Like the first pole would be on the ground, or some kid would pull it by accident, or the airplane would land in power lines and blow up, or worse, land in the middle of a Black Friday doorbuster. None of that happened, although one airplane got struck by lightning on the ground and puked the parachute out the back, and a couple have landed in power lines, but none blew up. Sometime around 1998, I stood in this place. It's the Cirrus factory in Duluth, Minnesota, and they were doing tests on the airframe by dropping it from the ceiling. Dale Klapmeyer told me two things I clearly remember. One, the parachute would be a wild ride, and the people in the airplane would live but wouldn't escape injury. And two, the airplane would be trashed, never to fly again. Those things turned out to be true sometimes and sometimes not. So what has happened? Was the Cirrus parachute system just a clever sales gimmick, or has it actually saved lives and made the airplane safer, as it was intended to do? I'll get to the numbers in a minute. But first, let's talk about how this system works. The parachute and rocket extractor are mounted behind the baggage compartment. The system weighs about 80 pounds, and the latest versions have a 55-foot round canopy. As parachutes go, that's pretty big. The activation lever is on the cabin ceiling and requires a 45-pound pull. That lights the rocket, and that pulls the canopy out of the airplane inside its deployment bag. You can see that clearly in this footage shot by the Coast Guard of a Cirrus that had a fuel issue over the Pacific Ocean in 2015. In 2 seconds, the shroud lines are fully stretched. Then the canopy comes out of the deployment bag and begins to inflate. This skinny donut thing is called a slider, and it slows the canopy inflation to reduce deployment loads. That's important because the parachute has to be made of light enough nylon to pack into a small volume, and the slider slows things down so the air loads don't shred the parachute during opening. Initially, the airplane is nose down, but there are pyrotechnic fuses on what are called snub lines, and they're designed to burn through and allow the airplane to assume a more upright attitude that spreads the impact load to the landing gear and the energy-absorbing seats. As Dale Klapmeyer said, depending on the landing surface, the touchdown is no picnic. But it's not a train wreck either. The vertical descent speed under canopy is about 1,700 feet per minute, or about 19 miles per hour. It's less than that if the parachute has horizontal component from drifting in the wind. Depending on the wind and sea state, a touchdown on water can be on the sporting side. This is probably...
Got to play this one at real speed, so watch carefully. I can't afford to play it twice at Paul's rates.
the best video of an actual touchdown on grass with what appears to be no horizontal wind component. The pilot got a small cut on his head, but essentially Both people were uninjured. CAPS did exactly what it was supposed to do. But overall, has the CAPS system really delivered? I dug back into our early reporting on the Cirrus starting in 1994 when the company touted the parachute, the 26G energy-absorbing seat and structure, cabin flail space, and state-of-the-art avionics as safety items. Without actually saying it, Cirrus invited buyers to think they were getting the safest light airplane ever. Initially, it didn't work out that way. Cirrus had a rash of early fatal accidents, and when I analyzed the accident data in 2012, the Cirrus line had a fatal accident rate slightly higher than the general aviation average. 6 years later, the Cirrus airplanes now have a fatal accident rate that's average or maybe even a little below the general aviation average. So what happened? Well, 2011 happened for one thing. That year, 31 Cirrus airplanes had accidents. 16 of them were fatal, 2 on just one day in November. A little before that, the Cirrus Owners and Pilots Association, COPA, and specifically this guy, the association safety expert, Rick Beach, figured out something. Most of these fatal accidents could have been prevented if the pilots had just used a parachute. This accident near the Bahama Islands in 2012 got a lot of press, positive press, and it kind of iced the cake on the push to train pilots in the use of CAPS. The military had the same problem when ejection seats first appeared in the 1950s. Pilots just weren't used to analyzing how to use that get me out of this thing button, so they dug a bunch of smoking holes while sitting in perfectly good ejection seats. So let's bore into Captain Ego's noggin here to understand the nature of the problem. When the poop hits the fan, our man doesn't want to immediately admit defeat because he is, after all, the immortal clone of Chuck Yeager. So he tries to work the problem and fix it. Except maybe he gets a little task saturated, which is fancy psychobabble for his brain turning to quivering mush. Not only has he forgotten about the CAPS handle a foot from his ear, he may be only vaguely aware he's in an airplane at all. Cirrus's dedicated CAPS training kind of installs another gear in the pilot's head that makes thinking about CAPS use part of the flight routine. For example, when climbing out after takeoff at 500 feet, the pilot verbalizes CAPS available to remind himself that the parachute is there. For other emergencies, say engine failures, turbulence, upsets, or loss of control, Cirrus now trains pilots to consider the parachute as the first option, not the last resort. Training also emphasizes that if you have any doubt about the survivability of the situation, use the parachute. Forget the stigma. It's better to go home at night with a good story than to ride your ego into a crater. The 500-foot call-out might suggest that the parachute can't be effective below that altitude, but Boris Popov, he's the guy who makes the parachute, says the better way to think about it is that the parachute can be used at any altitude and any speed, or at least speeds that aren't too fast. Cirrus gives the maximum demonstrated deployment speed as 133 to 140 knots, depending on the model, but the parachute has been successfully deployed at speeds much higher than that. Popov says that even at very low altitudes, deploying the parachute will offer some drag and reduce the G-forces in a crash, even if it doesn't fully deploy. The Cirrus Owners Group tracks CAPS polls carefully and currently lists 98 events. Of these, it claims 84 are saves, meaning lives were saved by using the parachute. I might quibble with that term save because it implies that whatever emergency the pilot confronted could only have been resolved by the parachutes. That's not always true in the case of an engine failure or even a loss of control. In fact, in 2 cases, pilots pulled the parachute, but it failed to deploy properly, and the pilots were forced to land trailing the malfunctioned parachute. Both did that safely. In a 3rd incident, the rocket didn't fire at all after the pilot lost control in clouds, but the pilot regained control and landed in a field. It turned out to have been a fault in the handle cable mechanism. Quite a few CAPS polls have been at low altitudes, as low as 300 feet, and the pilot and passengers have survived, often uninjured. This much is true. When CAPS has been used within a realistic operating envelope, survival of the aircraft occupants has been 100%. In other words, nobody has died for having decided to use the CAPS parachute, even when it didn't work correctly. But that's not to say there haven't been fatal accidents. COPA's data shows 8 fatal crashes in which parachute use was attempted or may have been attempted. One was a California crash in which the airplane was flying well over 200 knots, far above the maximum deployment speed. 8 others appear to have occurred because deployment was attempted at altitudes so low the parachute just didn't have time to deploy fully. Injuries have occurred in CAPS landings, but at a rate lower than Cirrus may have initially expected. In those 84 saves, I counted 19 accidents with minor injuries and 10 with serious injuries. Those are small total numbers to calculate meaningful rates, but I call the probability of a minor injury about 1 in 4 and a major injury about 1 in 8. It should come as no surprise that parachutes aren't perfect and neither is CAPS. In this accident, for reasons that weren't clear, the airplane struck nose first, injuring all 3 people aboard. The NTSB called it a faulty deployment. These pictures were in the accident docket because the aircraft was in a planned practice formation flight. A quick-thinking person in the wing airplane took the photos.
I'm going to cut Paul off here because I'm running out of my budgeted money for this video. Okay, seriously though, he makes a lot of good points about a number of things. Among them, the descent rate under the parachute will vary with several factors, but it's typically on the order of about 1,500 to 1,700 feet per minute. The parachute will drift with the wind. I have mixed feelings about whether Paul is right about whether a little bit of wind is going to help cushion the landing. I'll kind of get back to that in a little bit, but here's sort of my thinking on that. You know, when you think about sport parachutists, just people wearing parachutes jumping out of airplanes for fun. If you have a non-steerable round chute, you just drift with the wind. For people who are the sport parachutists with those rectangular chutes, okay, whether they steer themselves upwind or downwind, it doesn't matter. They have forward movement through the local air that they are in, and that forward movement can be used to create lift. And that's why if you go to an air show, you watch, you know, the Golden Knights or somebody come in, you know, these parachutists kind of late in the game, they end up at high speed, but then they're basically able to flare the chute with that extra speed, and they'll kind of flare, they'll round out, you know, hang just a couple inches off the grass and so on, and then settle down, and they just do this nice stand-up land. Of course, if I tried that, I'd be I'd be a statistic somewhere, so I better not try parachuting. But there's a difference between those round chutes and the sport parachutes. These are round chutes and so on, and my understanding, frankly, is that when they're drifting with the wind, you still have the same 1,500 or 1,700 feet per minute and so on, but the wind can complicate things a little bit. I don't care whether I'm right or Paul's right, because, as I'm going to show you here, regardless, landing with the wind, or without the wind for that matter, still carries some risks. And that's true of ejection seats, parachutes, or things like these ballistic recovery systems in Cirrus and other aircraft. They are not without risk. In many cases, they're wonderful. There is still risk, and so I want to ask this kind of question about what controllers can do to minimize the various risks. To get started with that, let's do it this way. I'm calling this intermediate level discussion. If I'd put the link to Paul's video on the intermediate level, you can only imagine how much he'd be charging me. All right, so I want to start by looking at the actual video of that Cirrus SR-22 that Paul alluded to. There's no audio with this one, okay? But I think there's something important here that's worth noting. If you watch the full video, and a lot of people don't have the attention span to maybe watch the full video. So they come up here to about the 27, 28 second mark, and they watch the parachute come out, and they watch the airplane descend, and the pilot has prepared for this, obviously, so he gets the door open before he touches down and so on. So you can see the door open. He's ready to exit the airplane. By the way, he was steered over near a cruise ship. Quick backstory on this. It was a ferry flight from, I think, California out to Hawaii, and on these kinds of flights, these ferry pilots go through a procedure where they install auxiliary fuel tanks, and for some reason after the halfway point he was no longer able to pump fuel out of the auxiliary tank, and so he knew he was going to end up short. So he had about, I think, 24, maybe 25 hours between the time he knew he had the problem and when he had to ditch a couple hours east of Hawaii. And so he certainly had time to prepare. So having that door open tells me this is a guy who's had a couple of hours, and if not a day or so, to kind of think about how he wants to have the airplane configured for the touchdown. But here's what I want you to look at. I want you to look at the landing and then also what happens the next minute or so after the touchdown. Watch what happens. There's touchdown. I'm going to pause it for 1 second and just note the time. 02:44 to 02. Watch for about the next minute, minute and a half. And there's no audio with this, so. See how it's getting drug at a fairly good clip? For the record, I was not able to find out what the wind strength was. Pilot was uninjured for what it's worth. But watch what happens because the wind is dragging the airplane through the water. Just by coincidence, it happens to be dragging it sideways. That right wing is now kind of digging in. And it's actually going to pull the airplane upside down. Okay, just file that in the way in the back of our minds. If we ever have a CAPS deployment and it looks like somebody is heading for water, if there is a wind component, there is a chance that just within a minute or so, again, look at the time here, he's already out of the airplane. Basically, within a minute of touchdown, the airplane flipped upside down and was still continuing to be dragged sideways. But just kind of file it away in the back of our brain if we ever have somebody making a CAPS deployment down into water. If there's any wind, that plane may or may not be upside down within a minute or so, and to the extent we can, if we have time to prepare somebody, make sure that they are prepared to think about that so that they have the door open in a Cirrus and are fully prepared to exit the airplane very quickly after it touches down. Again, just one of those little things that we may or may not think about. You're welcome, of course, to watch the full video. I'm going to jump out here. And then at the very end of the video where I stopped where Paul was talking, he referenced the Colorado SR-22 CAPS pull where for some undetermined reason the airplane struck the ground in a nose-low attitude. Just out of curiosity, I looked at that particular incident in the NTSB reports and sort of stumbled upon a couple things that I thought were a little surprising. They don't directly relate to why the airplane touched down nose low, but they're worth looking at nonetheless. So let's go to the NTSB final report for this accident. June of 2016, an SR-22, November 678 Zulu. 3 minor injuries. Those were the 3 people on board. So this was actually a training event for Cirrus pilots who were interested in doing like one of these mass formation flights into AirVenture Oshkosh. And so this particular training event, a bunch of Cirrus pilots show up at Colorado Springs. It's a very organized event. Okay, a lot of safety things are going on and so on. And so What happened on this particular flight, it was a formation flight with a couple of other aircraft. You have the pilot flying the airplane. You have a safety pilot in the right seat who's Cirrus qualified, but the only thing he's there for is for safety during the formation practice. There's another pilot in the rear seat who's observing so that he can learn too, although it would have been socially rude for him to sit up in the front seat with the pilot as well. So having said that, they ended up with a loss of power. The airplane could not maintain altitude, and he finally pulled the chute at about 500 feet above ground level and so on. Now, for whatever reason, the chute didn't bring the airplane back up to the level attitude that it normally would, so the NTSB report is going to go into a technical discussion about that. For our purposes, I'm not concerned with that. Okay. But if you look at the factual information for the flight, it's going to talk about the COPA, the Cirrus Owner and Pilots Association Flying Clinic. They're doing some stuff. They have the engine problem. They try to make it back to landing at Colorado Springs, about 11 miles west. That's not going to work. Maybe this Meadow Lake Airport 6 miles north. That's not going to work. There's no suitable landing area, so he pulled the caps handle. The rocket fired. The parachute comes out, and so on. Okay, having said that, the parachute had its problem, and they made the landing. Now, here's one of the things I want to look at. So first of all, what I'm particularly interested in is this paragraph here. It says the safety pilot, again, this is the pilot in the right seat, and again, his only job is to provide safety with regard to the formation part of the flight. In all other aspects, the pilot in the left seat was the PIC for the flight. And so that's why this says the safety pilot reported that the pilot in command would pull the caps unless incapacitated, as briefed during pre-flight briefing. In other words, just because the dude in the right seat's one of these so-called Cirrus safety pilots, if he feels unsafe and feels like it's time to pull the chute, he's not allowed to pull the chute. That's up to the PIC only. Don't go pulling the chute in my airplane, dude. Okay? Unless that pilot in the left seat was incapacitated from something like maybe a mid-air collision where that pilot's incapacitated, the airplane's damaged, and then the guy in the right seat's allowed to pull the chute. Otherwise, don't touch my chute, dude. All right. According to the safety pilot in the right seat, the pilot's previous and overriding training habit kicked as he looked for a place to land. Now, think about that sentence for a second. That makes it sound like this guy had the engine failure, and since most pilots are thinking, all right, I got to put this down somewhere, kind of implies that's what the pilot was doing, and maybe he wasn't thinking about the caps. So you have this safety pilot in the right seat who's aware of the caps, but he's not allowed to pull it because they talked about this, right? And so the pilot verified with the safety pilot, don't worry, dude, I'm intending to deploy the caps, and he ended up pulling the caps handle at the safety pilot's second request. We'll have a little more detail about that in a second with a smile on our face. Okay, by that point, they were down to 7,000 feet MSL. The indicated airspeed was 80 knots, and the parachute comes out and so on. Having said that, it talks about this, but then when they did hit, again, this is the safety pilot, he says, I screamed in pain. So he had pain, even though it was officially a minor injury. It was enough where it caused him a bit of pain. For what it's worth, it talks about grab the hammer, start whacking away at the forward part of the door window. The Cirrus airplanes come with a hammer so that if the door is jammed, you can kind of hack your way out of the airplane. The rear seat passenger told me, the safety pilot tried to open my door, so that one opened. I crawled out, went to move the seat forward, but the rear seat passenger had already slithered out, so I went down to wing 2, then the pilot comes out as well, and so on. For what it's worth, though, I want to also note this little detail. It says the passenger helped the accident pilot egress out of the right side door. The safety pilot in the accident airplane, that's the guy that was in the right front seat, reported that first responders helped deflate and wrap up the chute. Help deflate and wrap up the chute. What happened was after touchdown, there was a wind, and so the chute remained inflated. After that, his neck started hurting again, and this is kind of benign. It says the 3 occupants were subsequently transported to a hospital to be evaluated. For what it's worth, the NTSB was kind enough to write down the wind so I could use it in this video. Wind was 9 gusting to 16. So 9 gusting to 16 is enough to keep that chute inflated, assuming that it doesn't snag on a tree or something like that. We also have the witness statement from the rear seat passenger, and one of the things I want to note from here is a little bit of detail about the pulling of the caps chute for what it's worth. So I'll pick up with this. We were descending in a controlled fashion with partial power. Al, who's the pilot in the left seat, was looking for a suitable landing site. He reached up, removed the cap's handle cover, tilted the handle down, still looking around the area, and then I looked again at the multi-function display, saw 56% power with the throttle full forward, so clearly the engine has some kind of problem. And this is the right seat safety pilot's second request. Pull it now! Sorry if I blew your ears off. And that's the point at which I'll pull the handle, so that it's, you kind of get the impression, again, I haven't talked to these people to get the full skinny on this, but you kind of get the impression that the pilot's a little bit reluctant. Remember, he didn't pull the chute till 472 feet AGL. You kind of get the impression that the safety pilot's like, pull it now, dude. And I want to be careful about reading too much into this, but it does seem like, and Paul Bertorelli alluded to this in his video, there have been occasions when pilots perhaps wait a little too long. Now that opens up a huge can of worms for us controllers. We can't be just recommending to pilots that they pull the chute, but we will talk about that a little bit. Having said that, then we're at the lower altitude. We almost immediately impacted the ground and so on. Harry, the right seat pilot, was screaming in pain. Okay, he was able to recover enough to get the right door open, exited the aircraft, and for what it's worth, I want to note this. The parachute was still inflated behind the aircraft and was starting to drag it backwards. Again, remember the wind was 9 gusting to 16, and we then worked together to deflate and roll up the chute. From the final report, it says that the first responders helped with that. So apparently the 3 pilots themselves were a little bit unsuccessful. And for what it's worth, the right seat and rear seat passengers were flown by helicopter to the hospital. However, they were both released within a day, and it ended up being just minor injuries. I want to look at one other thing, and again, kind of deduce a little bit of something about the wind in this particular thing. As Paul Bertorelli alluded to, because they were doing formation practice, some quick thinking person in one of the other aircraft took a lot of pictures. And because of that, Rick Beach, who's the aviation safety chair for the COPA, did a photo analysis report for the NTSB investigation. I want to focus on one still photograph from after the touchdown. So we're going to go practically to the end, and we're going to go to this one here. Nope. We're going to go to that one there, figure 16. A detail from a picture that was taken approximately 2 minutes after impact. All 3 occupants, remember the right seat passenger had been screaming in pain a couple minutes earlier. All 3 occupants have exited the aircraft and appear ambulatory. Okay, but notice, and this is just sheer coincidence as far as I can tell, the direction that the parachute is inflated is going to be downwind of the aircraft. Remember the description, it was dragging the aircraft somewhat. So we have these men who are perhaps a bit injured. By coincidence, the only door that they can easily open is on the right side of the aircraft, and so they are now on the downwind side of the aircraft. And at least maybe should cross our mind, is there a way to think about reminding pilots and passengers, if they have one of these CAPS deployments, they're going to end up in some area like this, and the wind is 9 gusting 16. When you exit the aircraft, remain clear of the downwind side of the aircraft. That's at least something for us to think about putting in a controller's checklist. Okay, so enough on November 6, 7, 8 Zulu. Let's talk about some other issues for controllers. So first of all, once the chute is deployed, there is no such thing as undeployment. There's no changing your mind. You are a passenger on board that airplane, no matter which seat you're sitting in, once the parachute comes out, unless it's one of these exceptionally rare cases, and I believe that's all totally fixed now, although I can't guarantee it, where the chute had a defective deployment. And then you're just going to have to deal with what you're going to have to deal with. So the airplane will drift with the wind. So on that, again, remember it's going to come down at ballpark 1,500 feet per minute. A lot of these parachute pulls are going to happen within 1,500 feet or so of the ground, perhaps less. And so there's only going to be about 1 minute worth of wind speed distance that they're going to drift. If for some reason we have somebody who deploys the parachute up higher, and I'll show you the checklist in a minute, some of these pilots are going to turn off the master switch pretty quickly, and so we might think we have their last recorded position. But if they're going to take perhaps 5 minutes or so to drift down, they might end up a little bit a ways, and especially in an area of rough terrain, it's nice to know this as much as possible. So try to track the airplane with regard to the surrounding terrain as closely as possible, including using something like FlightAware and or Flight Radar 24 if we can, even if we're getting to that like a couple minutes after they've pulled the parachute in some circumstance, okay? So they've pulled the parachute, they've killed the master, that means we've lost the transponder, the ADS Bravo, and so on, and then somebody goes over to the computer, it's slow to load, we type in the N number, we pull it up, we set up the map so we can see where they are with regard to local terrain. Even though that's a few few minutes old by this point, we're still going to show the last known position of the aircraft with regard to the local terrain, then do the best you can, kind of knowing what the winds aloft and the surface wind should be in the local area, and I bet we can pin the actual touchdown spot to within a very narrow margin. And having said that, let's go to what's the Cirrus CAPS guide. So this is a guide that's put out by Cirrus for the CAPS Airframe Parachute System, and we're going to kind of skim through this and note a couple things. So a little bit about the history and so on, some of the original design and tests and certification, how it works. So you activate it, the rocket pulls it out, it then inflates, it disreefs, okay, it restores the nose back to that level flight attitude, you get snub line release, and then touchdown. Again, the airplane is going to descend at something less than 1,700 foot per minute at gross weight, less descent rate at lighter weights and so on, and ground impact is expected to be equivalent to dropping from a height of about 13 feet or so. I'm going to skip this, Paul Bergarelli alluded to that and so on. As long as you activate it within any kind of a normal thing, there have been 0 fatalities. Now, there are possible deployment situations, and again, I'd like controllers to be at least loosely aware of these. So a loss of control, okay, because of flight control problems, severe turbulence, disorientation, icing, pilot has a loss of situational awareness or some kind of spatial disorientation. That's a circumstance where pilots might pull the chute. Engine failure situations, I'm not going to go through the details here, but basically engine failure situations, they may pull the chute. If they're over a suitable runway, so if they're relatively high and if the runway is relatively long and so on, okay, then, maybe you don't need to pull the parachute, you just do a normal dead stick landing. However, if you're particularly down low or it's going to be a really short runway or there's some other problem, Cirrus recommends the pilot should activate CAPS. If you're not over a runway, if it's low IMC, if it's night, okay, mountainous terrain, pull the chute. Pilot incapacitation, and this can be from a pilot's medical condition to something like a bird strike or airplanes bumping together during formation flight training. CAPS activation strongly recommended. The mid-air collision, I guess I kind of alluded to that one already. Strongly recommended. Structural failure. Structural failure has never occurred in a Cirrus aircraft. However, if a structural failure were to occur, CAPS activation is strongly recommended. There's some discussion here about speeds and altitude and so on. Having said that, there are some success stories that they publish in this thing that's partially sales guide. Also, a couple of notations about when pilots could arguably have used CAPS to save their lives but didn't. Here in 2005, you had an instrument-rated pilot depart IFR from Fort Lauderdale. He climbed into IMC soon after takeoff, misinterpreted a series of ATC instructions. He told ATC, I got to get my act together. A minute later, he says, I have avionics problems. After 40 seconds, okay, he says, I'm losing it. He ended up losing control, never used the CAPS. Again, start to think about this provocative question. If we know we're talking to a Cirrus and this is somebody who's having all kinds of problems, avionics problems, I'm losing it, is that the kind of thing where we possibly recommend they use CAPS? Ugh, thorny issue. Again, remember, these CAPS deployments are not without risk, okay? Arizona 2006. Basically, the pilot gets in an area of convective activity that contains icing. For what it's worth, data showed the airplane stalled, entered a spin for 14 rotations in 45 seconds until impacting the ground. The pilot never activated CAPS. Cirrus and like severe icing, if they don't pull the CAPS on their own, do we recommend? Attempted power off landing, again, kind of an inhospitable area and so on. The pilot was killed, severely injured the passenger and so on. So if you have to activate CAPS over trees, probably better than making an off-airport, normal kind of landing and so on. So this is going to talk about things like barriers contributing to CAPS indecision. For controllers, I want us to have a great reluctance, and in fact, I'll give you some suggested phraseology here, but I want us to at least think about what we might do in situations like the 3 that are mentioned in this Cirrus CAPS guide. Okay, so this is going to talk about some of the things that pilots think about. They're going to go through some other tips and so on. I will note this, CAPS deployment procedures as we finish up looking here, skimming through the Cirrus CAPS guide. So the deployment procedure, and this is essentially true for all aircraft that use this, even though officially this is really for the Cirrus SR 20s and 22s. So you take the cover over the handle and remove it if you didn't remove it earlier in the flight, which some pilots do, myself included. activated. Take the activation handle, use both hands. You can do it one-handed if you're strong enough. Pull straight down. Takes about 45 pounds of force. Okay. After that, the mixture cut off, so you're turning off the engine. That's for a couple reasons. One, it's going to reduce the risk of fire. Number two, again, going back to the idea that once you pull the chute, that's it, assuming the chute has deployed properly and it's not one of these improper deployments. But once you pull the chute, you do not want to run the engine. You do not want to try to steer the aircraft. You don't want to leave it running and maybe use the rudder to steer it in some direction and just give it a little burst of power. Any efforts to do that can spill air from the chute. There's nothing really a controller can do about that. That's kind of an FYI. But the engine gets turned off, so mixture to cut off, fuel selector off, fuel pump off. Battery and alternator master switches off. Now, once they do that, they're no longer talking to us, and we no longer see them on radar, unless maybe we can track a primary for a minute or two. So, if time permits, declare the emergency and announce CAPS activation. I'm kind of informing controllers of this, so it's possible we have somebody who gets into one of these situations, and they very quickly pull the chute, they're killing the engine, and they say, this is Cirrus so-and-so, CAPS deployment, and then suddenly it's radar and radio contact lost. If you hear CAPS deployment, CAPS activation, CAPS whatever, okay, that's what they're talking about. Then you do some further things, so the ignition switch off, so you kill the magnetos, ELT on, they may or may not do that, and then you get things like make sure the seat belts are nice and tight, security loose items, assume kind of a brace position. I would open the door in most cases if I was on board one of these airplanes, and then after the airplane comes to a complete stop, evacuate quickly and move upwind, because in high winds, and to my mind, I'm thinking just, kind of 9 gusting 16, certainly 10 gusting 20 or something like that, the parachute may inflate and drag the aircraft after touchdown, and therefore, once you get out of the airplane, remain upwind of the aircraft. That's just one of those little tiny things where if, for whatever reason, we're talking to somebody who has time to think about what they're going to do before they're doing a CAPS deployment, I think that controllers should remind that after getting out of the airplane, remain upwind of it if there's any significant wind at all. Alternatively, we can remind them to do their CAPS checklist. And there might be rare cases where somebody pulls the CAPS chute and doesn't turn everything off right away, in which case we perhaps remind them of that. Okay, almost done. Okay, so can we tell a pilot to pull the chute? Well, if we are going to say anything at all, I would recommend that the phraseology be either something like consider CAPS use or advise us if you use CAPS. We're not ever going to recommend, as far as I'm concerned. I will give a small exception to that later. But basically, we are not going to recommend, but we're just sort of reminding them, dude, ma'am, You've got that CAPS in your airplane. We're just reminding you of it. And again, choose which diplomatic track you want to use, but just say consider CAPS use. We're just reminding them it's there. It's totally up to them. Or the even more benign, advise us if you use CAPS. And again, that just plants the bug in the pilot's mind that, I've got that thing. The controllers know and they'll help me out. It's still entirely up to the pilot. So under what kinds of possible situations should controllers maybe use one or another of these pieces of phraseology? Well, first of all, I'm going to say pilot incapacitation events. Certainly, the pilot has the proverbial heart attack. The passenger gets on the radio or something like that. Okay, my pilots died. My pilots had the heart attack, and we know that they're in a Cirrus aircraft. Well, that's the kind of situation where, among other things, we might be recommending to the passenger to pull the parachute, in which case we're not going to be, beating around the bush here. We're going to be a little more direct. The reason I put the double asterisk is because I will cover that specific scenario in a separate video as part of the pilot incapacitation series here on the website. But the basic idea is in most of these situations we would have time and we'd actually like to get them set up rather than just pulling it right away. Under the pilot incapacitation series there are a couple of specialty situations. One is hypoxia. So if the pilot is hypoxic, there are some extra things to think about, including whether we have them pull the chute up high or the chute at all. Again, arguably, normally we're not going to tell a pilot to pull the CAPS parachute. If somebody is hypoxic, they have arguably lost sense of their full faculties and they are no longer acting entirely as the pilot in command. And I can envision that it is theoretically possible, although exceptionally rare, that we might have a hypoxic pilot in a Cirrus. Having said that, interestingly, most of these Cirrus aircraft now have avionics that can automatically descend the aircraft and help with hypoxia situations, so that's going to be a little bit tricky. That might take a little bit more work. Carbon monoxide. So again, if we have a Cirrus situation, and for any pilot incapacitation situation, if we have a passenger get on the frequency, one of the first things I advocate is that we try to assess, is anybody else feeling sick on the airplane, because we want to protect against the possibility of carbon monoxide poisoning. If you have a passenger who's now on the radio saying the pilot's having some difficulty and it seems like it's a carbon monoxide situation, I would recommend that we tell them to pull the chute pretty darn quick, but they also need to get the engine shut off. The passengers might not know about getting the engine shut off in those particular situations. Again, I'll allude to this a little bit when I film it in the separate video, but in these cases, I'd actually like them to get ready to pull the chute. I'd like them to take the mixture knob, and about the time they're pulling the mixture all the way back, immediately thereafter, giving the good strong tug on the parachute. At that point, we need to make sure that the parachute comes out. Alternatively, we might have them bring the throttle back to idle, and that way the engine is just at idle power. Pull the chute, make sure the chute comes out, and then kill the mixture. That might even be the better one. Okay, engine failures, that's going to be pretty much up to the pilot and so on. Maybe we might just say advise us if you use CAPS. Again, in the engine failure situations you saw from the Cirrus CAPS guide, it's not exactly entirely clear, and maybe it's a little tough to know how to read that NTSB report and the witness statement, but that pilot in Colorado Springs might have been delaying on the CAPS just a little bit too long. Okay, landing gear. You think this is a trick question because the Cirrus airplanes have fixed landing gear. That's true, but don't forget the Cirrus SF-50 Vision Jet does have retractable landing gear. This one we can just ignore, and that's because before somebody starts flying in the jet, okay, they have to take at least 2 lessons in how to fly a jet. I'm kidding. It's I think it's like 3 lessons. But anyway, they get specific training in landing gear malfunctions, and it would be entirely up to them. We would never make a recommendation in that case. For what it's worth, if it was my butt in a Vision Jet and I had trouble getting the landing gear down, I would rather touch down on the runway with the faulty gear than pull the chute. Not that I care about the insurance company. For VFR and IMC situations, so if we're talking to a Cirrus pilot against VFR and IMC, should we maybe kind of plant the bug or even recommend that they pull the parachute? This one, it kind of depends. If it seems like they're stable, especially perhaps if they're on autopilot, they've got one of these blue level buttons, we get them into just like a simple altitude hold and heading and just kind of use the autopilot to keep them out of the get them out of the IMC and the VMC conditions. Actually, we get them out of IMC conditions to VMC conditions in that circumstance. It's probably riskier to pull the chute. If somebody is a VFR pilot in IMC and they are really struggling with stability of the aircraft and we're worried about protecting against one of these graveyard spirals and they're really having trouble holding any kind of just a stable heading or altitude, let alone, for a target, on a heading or a target altitude. But if they're just all over the place, then we plant the bug. If they seem to be doing fine, especially on autopilot with some basic modes, don't mention the chute at all. Multiple missed approaches. This is the IFR pilot in IMC who's having trouble landing. They're making multiple missed approaches. They're getting low on fuel, or they're ferrying an airplane from California to Hawaii and they know they're getting low on fuel. It might be best to set up for like an ideal location and then pull the chute. Instrumentation issues when they're IMC. If they're VMC, instrumentation issues you almost don't care about from a safety perspective, even if they have some trouble doing precise navigation. But if there are instrumentation issues and there are IMC, in principle, I would treat it kind of like that VFR and IMC. If it looks like the airplane's fairly stable, they're probably not going to pull the chute, and I wouldn't say a word. If they're having some stability issues, I would lean personally towards this one. Just advise us if you plan on using CAPS. If they have flight control issues, again, in principle, again, there's an infinite variety, so we can't go into too much detail. If they're having troubles controlling the airplane, maybe they use it, maybe not. Personally, I would lean over towards advise us if you use CAPS. In-flight fires. In-flight fires, is one personally. Again, everybody's going to be a little bit different. I'm giving you my personal opinion. If it's my butt in the airplane and there's a fire on board, I would not pull the parachute because it's going to delay the descent. And this is just me. I'd rather not sit in a burning airplane coming down at 1,500 feet a minute from 4,000 or 5,000 feet and just sit there burning, for 3 minutes or so. That's up to me. So in-flight fire, they're probably going to make a forced landing without pulling the chute. All right, last thing we're going to look at is this. I call it information for first responders. Because of the way these parachutes come out with the rocket, there are actually a couple of specialized safety things to think about. Now, to be clear, as controllers, we're never going to deal with the stuff that's in what's known as the Cirrus First Responder Information Manual. And even though this is put out by Cirrus, it's applicable to other BRS aircraft. And so I'm just going to kind of end on this note. So here's what it looks like at 66 pages. We are not going to go through it and so on. Having said that, if you want to, you can kind of skim through some of these things where it talks about some of the hazards and so on and what's involved. I bring it up because of this. There are cases where the Cirrus aircraft maybe has an accident, comes down somewhere, and the parachute has not been used. It is conceivable that first responders will go to the scene of an airplane crash, if they're not ARF trained, not realize that this airplane has a live rocket and so on. Therefore, this will be pretty rare. But anytime we know that we have a Cirrus aircraft go down and we are talking to first responders, 2 counties away from where our facility is or 2 states away from where our center is or something, to the extent we can, when we call local 911, I think it would be a good idea if we inform them that because it's a Cirrus aircraft, it has a built-in rocket as part of the parachute system, and that we find a way to make sure that they are at least aware of, if we don't actually have a way to send them the PDF directly of this document, so that those brave and heroic first responders can protect themselves and others when they respond to the scene of a Cirrus aircraft that has gone down. So on that note, we're going to finish up. The parachutes are good systems, but like ejection seats, they do carry risks. For any emergency situation, we're often looking for what is least bad. And you know what? I do fly the Cirrus occasionally. I like having the parachute in there, even if some people might not think I'm a real pilot because I like having the chute. Thank you.